Hello, let's see what it takes to install Raspbian with Noobs onto your Raspberry Pi. In doing so, I will be using the resources offered from the Pi Academy, and along the way I will try to integrate those instructions and those resources with some additional tips to make the installation of Raspbian even easier for you. Let's see what it takes. First things first, let's see what we need in order to proceed to go to the installation of Noobs. First of all, of course, we need a Raspberry Pi, and you might have one of the old types, or most probably you're going to have one of the new ones, which is the Raspberry Pi 2. So the first thing I would really recommend is for it to go into an enclosure. Having an enclosure is always a good idea. Getting the Raspberry Pi out of the enclosure to do something more interesting is always very easy in any case. So if you have one of these old ones, there are many type of enclosures you can use, and these are only some of the ones that are available out there. I have a few, and this is the one that goes with the Raspberry Pi 2. All these ones are for Raspberry Pi 1. Which enclosure you choose is really up to you and down to mostly what is that you're going to be doing in the future. For example, I used this enclosure when I was using the Raspberry Pi as a media center onto my television. I still do. This enclosure is really nice because it does protect the SD card, at least on the old ones where the SD card was one that would be sticking out of the board quite substantially. But this is also very handy in the sense that it opens up very quickly, and so you can get your Pi outside of the enclosure to do something else. Many other enclosures will have all sorts of holes on the sides in order to be able to get the Raspberry Pi cam or the GPIO extension lead outside of the box. So really choosing which one should be very much down to how you're going to think you're going to use your Raspberry Pi. But in any case, let's focus now on what's most probable in your hands right now, which is the Raspberry Pi 2, the latest addition to the various types of Raspberry Pis. And this is the official enclosure, which has been blessed by the foundation and in part co-designed by the foundation. So fitting the Raspberry Pi in here is very easy, but the first thing you will need to do is to add the SD card to the Raspberry Pi. Nowadays, most probably, whichever shop you're going to be using, you're going to be getting one of these, which comes as a standard SD card with a micro SD card inserted in here. So of course this is all good if you're using one of the old Raspberry Pis, and that's the type of format that they will take, so they will need the adapter in order to use the micro SD card. But in case you use one of the Raspberry Pi 2, then that's just right, that goes just right in here. And if you can hear the clicking noise, of course I don't pretend you don't know, I don't pretend to teach you how to insert an SD card, but you know, that's what it should be doing. It's really just pushing and setting in, pushing and getting out. So that's how it works. So the other thing you want to have is a power supply. This is a power supply for Raspberry Pi, which is rated as 5 volts. And let's see if I show you that. Yeah, 5 volts and 2 amps. So one of the things I may want to say about power supplies is that I would rather go with something like this as 2 amps better than the ones that are used mostly for mobile phones, which tend to be 1 amp only. Now in some cases those ones will be slightly misrated and not provide enough current for the Raspberry Pi to work correctly. So although in the majority of cases the power supply for the mobile phones are going to be absolutely fine, and in fact this is one of the reasons why the designer of the Raspberry Pi had used the microSD connector here, so that power supplies for telephones could be used. For the majority of cases those will be absolutely perfectly fine, but if you do experience some issues, in some cases it will be down to the power supply not being able to provide enough current. So do check whether your power supply has at least 2 amps, and if it does have 1 amp, it may be slightly misrated, and that could be one of the reasons why you might want to buy a dedicated power supply for your Pi. They come incredibly cheap, so that's not really what's gonna break your budget. And the other thing you will need to have is of course a keyboard, whether it is wired or not, and a mouse. More often than not you will get these sort of things from some old computers that you might have, or some friend that will be getting rid of one keyboard and a mouse. You will find them even at charity shops. Or you may want to go with the wireless solution, which for example in the case of the Raspberry Pi Type 1 was actually very good, as the Raspberry Pi 1 had only 2 USB connectors, and so if you wanted to attach anything else but a keyboard and mouse, you will be fairly stuck, and you would probably needed a hub and all sorts of other bits and pieces. Now clearly with the Raspberry Pi 2 the problem has gone more or less away, as we do have plenty of USB ports available for us. The other thing you need to remember in case you're using a Raspberry Pi 1 is that it never was able to deal with the hot plug of any device through the USBs. So if you are connecting anything to the Raspberry Pi Type 1, then do so before you start your Raspberry Pi, before you power it up. Otherwise the Pi will reset, and you may not understand what really happened there. It was to do with the fact that the USBs weren't able to support the increased demand in current of the devices that would be attached here, and as a result the Raspberry Pi would reboot. So that's one tip which I think you need to be aware of. That's clearly not the case anymore with the Raspberry Pi 2, so if you do have one of those, do not worry, this behavior will not be something that will hit you. The other thing you're going to need, of course, is a monitor, which you will most probably want to plug into the HDMI port. Again, the design here was made very cleverly in this way, so that if you do not happen to have a monitor at hand, you can still use your television, your home television, to connect the Raspberry Pi in. The other choice would be to use something that goes through this connector, but I really wouldn't want to go there. Pretty much everybody nowadays would probably have an HDMI television or monitor at hand, and should be using this port instead. Last but not least, of course, we need to provide some connectivity to the Raspberry Pi, and I would suggest, especially at the beginning, to just simply use the Ethernet available on the board. If you have a monitor that comes with a DVI connector, get yourself an adapter which will go from DVI to HDMI, and the problem is solved. Whether you're going to be using one of these or you're going to be needing one of these, we now need to look at how to install Noobs onto the card, so that we can then insert it into the Raspberry Pi and download our favorite distribution, Raspbian. So let's move on to the computer and see what we need to do.